Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We're so excited to have you here. We're going to wait just another minute or two and let people continue to file in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So just housekeeping while we're waiting. You can use the questions and the questions panel on the GoToWebinar there, and we can see your questions, and we'll answer those throughout the webinar.
Hello, Midland, Texas.
All right, great. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen.
And hello from Houston.
Great. Can everyone see that okay? You can see the presentation. All right, great. We'll go ahead and get started then. My name is Winston Chenery. I'm the Senior Director of Marketing for Teachstone, and shortly I will introduce our speakers, but I just wanted to welcome everyone to the webinar and introduce the topic, which is supporting teachers and young learners as they return to classrooms, interactions at the heart of healing. And we have so much great content to cover today, I don't want to waste any time. So I will skip through this slide. And just a quick note, I wanted to introduce Michael Gonzalez, who's going to say a few words to kick us off.
Thank you, Winston. I really got to update that photo. But anyways, Texas AOIC is thrilled to partner with Teachstone on Circle Time, well, on the webinar series that's related to our Circle Time for Challenging Times. We know that interactions matter now more than ever, and that teachers and children need our voices now more than ever. It's an honor to have, and as you'll introduce, Dr. Sarah Haddon from Teachstone and Mary Margaret Gardner for today's webinar. We thank you guys again for your support and your partnership. And Winston, I'll let you introduce them. Thank you.
Great, sure thing. And I'll actually let Sarah and Mary Margaret introduce each other. Sarah and Mary Margaret, I will just say, are some of my favorite people in the entire world. They're my colleagues at Teachstone. They are class experts and just wonderful people. So it's a joy to have them on the webinar today. I'll let them give a little bit of their background, and they're going to present the content this afternoon. So I will let you two take it from here.
Okay. Would you like me to go first, Mary Margaret?
Why not? You're like your head's over mine, so I think you should.
Oh, okay. Well, I am delighted to introduce Mary Margaret Gardner. If you all do not know her, she's been with Teachstone for quite some time, has trained thousands and thousands of people in class. She has decades of experience working with young children and is one of the most passionate advocates of young children I know. And she worked at Teachstone for a long time now. She is retired, but coming back as a consultant to do this, and I'm very grateful that she's here today.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that, and I have known Sarah about, gosh, I don't know, 11 years, 12 years, and been privileged enough to work with you for the past 9, going on 10 years when Sarah hired me at Teachstone. I don't know if that was the best thing she ever did or the worst, but I'm really glad that I spent a lot of time with Teachstone.
It was a good decision.
And I have been in the field for about 46 years. I don't think you know this, Sarah, but I was active on the state AUIC board for Virginia and South Carolina, and then served on the affiliate panel back in the day after reorganization the first time. So all my AUIC friends, I reach out to you and applaud the work you're doing. Sarah has so much experience as a special ed teacher, as a college teacher, as a class queen. She was really instrumental in the early work for the class, doing MTP, like the seminal work for what we now know as the class observation tool. So I admire her tremendously. We have a mutual fan club here, and I'm really excited and thankful to be able to be sharing in this really important webinar today. And I appreciate Winston and Sarah and Amanda, who's on there also, for inviting me to participate.
I would just have to jump in. I can't take credit for the development of class, but I can. I did a lot with our first professional development programs based on class.
You didn't write it, but you were.
I worked on it early on.
You got it.
16 years. All right, next slide, Winston.
Yeah, so if you could just type into the questions panel there where you're from, and we can see your responses, just so we can get a sense of where people are tuning in from.
I
So
see we have Beaumont. Yeah, I saw somebody typed in earlier in Midland. I remember I drove to Texas one time from North Carolina. I got to Beaumont and I thought I was in Texas, but I learned that it took a really long time to get down to Big Bend. Dallas, we've got. I can't even say that. Wakachi, Frisco.
Wakachi,
yeah, Midlands.
San Antonio, Austin.
San Antonio.
Kansas, yay.
Maryville.
Topeka, Kansas. I was born in Kansas, yay.
So I was born in Temple, Texas at Scott and White Hospital, and I was there for about a week. So I don't really remember anything other than it was probably loud and bright, but I do love Texas. And San Antonio.
I'm pretty sure I've been to a distillery in New Braunfels. My niece and her husband live down there. Commerce, San Antonio. Someone from Missouri, thank you for joining us. Thank you all. Thanks for everybody for joining us.
Lots and lots and lots of good people from Texas. So
yes,
let's see what about that. Yeah, how about that poll?
Go Texas State.
Yeah, so we'll next thing up, we're going to do just a quick poll, and actually don't send this in the questions. We actually are going to use the poll functionality here. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how are you doing today? And I actually changed the responses here to not just 1 to 5, but not good at all, not so good, doing okay, pretty good, and doing great. So we're collecting the poll responses here. We'll give this just a couple of minutes. Okay, great. I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll. I think we've got a good read on how everybody's doing. So we'll just share the results really quickly. Everybody's doing okay, pretty good.
Yeah, that's nice to see, because I know it's been a really hard 3 months.
It sure has, and I think sometimes I might be at the bottom of that, those choices, and sometimes at the top, depending on what's going on with the day. So I'm glad to see that people are in a pretty good space right now.
Yep, and then we're gonna do one more poll just to kind of take a pulse. And so I'm gonna launch this poll, and if you wouldn't mind just answering, and this will be our last poll of the day, but this will help us to understand where your concerns are around children as you're coming back to school. And if you have other as your selection, go ahead and send in the questions panel there. You know, what is it that is your biggest concern? All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and close that poll and share the results here.
You know, when we came up with those questions, Sarah, I think maybe the first one in red and the third one in purple is probably could be combined, because I was a director of early childhood centers for a very long time, and I can't even imagine how it's going to be to try to manage with the COVID restrictions and function. So I can see we're all in the same boat.
Yeah.
Yep, for sure.
Okay, thanks everybody for doing that. It's helpful to us.
So our objectives for today would be to help talk a little bit about the biological and environmental impacts that influence children's development. We're going to talk a little bit about COVID-19 as it relates to the children, the family, and the teachers, staff. If that we see, you know, everybody's had a little bit different experience, and so we can talk a little bit about that. We'll be talking about interactions and relationships and how they can affect healing for children and families. And then we'll talk a little bit about strategies to support children and establish that sense of community and really focus on social emotional learning and supporting people as we do come back to whatever that new normal really is.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have, I think maybe we have one more poll. Winston, is that right? To see who's here?
Yes, you're correct.
Oh, yeah.
We do.
He was
And I
just
don't
kidding.
know actually that we.
Oh,
No, this is.
okay.
I don't know that we have this built
Set
out
up.
as a poll here.
Okay.
Let me see.
Well, I can roll with that.
Yeah,
So,
I don't think that we do.
okay, well, if you could put
Okay.
into the chat box just one of those roles. So if you're a coach or mentor, you could just put coach or observer, administrator, or teacher, and we can just kind of take a look and see what we have out there. I'm going to open up the questions. Teacher, administrator, director, coach, mentor, owners. We got some owners, mental health consultant. Great.
That's great.
Assistant director, teacher, observers, trainers. Oh, we have a really great, I'm certainly not going to be able to count that, but looks like we do have a really good variety of people in our group, which is terrific. Very happy about that.
Yeah.
All right, let's go ahead to the next slide. Thank you, Winston.
Yeah.
All right, so what is trauma and why is it harmful to children? So that's what we're going to start talking about right now. So we're going to go ahead to the next slide. That's such a sad picture for me to look at. So we know that many, go ahead, Sarah.
I'm sorry, I'm just trying to figure out if my computer screen is stuck or if it's been advanced.
We're on what is trauma slide? That would be your slide number 8. So what trauma is something that is threatening or dangerous that happened to young children. And there's a lot of things that could cause trauma, but they might threaten that child's safety or the safety of the parents or caregivers. And so we have different kinds of things that affect children and families. One is trauma, which is an emotional or physiological or psychological residue left from heightened levels of toxic stress. So pleasant things that happen, and when we see these over and over again, it can cause what we call toxic stress, where it's done over a long period of time, and the repercussions from those depend on individual children we'll talk about and individual experiences, etc. What we look at sometimes is called the ACES, which is the adverse childhood experiences. And those could be, we'll talk about that on another slide, but some aspects of the child's environment that can undermine their feelings of safety and stability and connection. And then we'll be thinking about trauma-informed care. So how do we empower children? How do we help them heal and help them feel safe and connected? So if we move on to the next slide, there's lots of things that can cause trauma, and what might be traumatic for one person may not necessarily be traumatic for another, or the effects of it may not be as significant for one person as it might be for another. But natural disasters, so floods and hurricanes. I know in Texas there's lots of flooding, child abuse and neglect, chaotic household. And you can imagine what that might look like in COVID, where we have just all of a sudden, the children are there all the time, and parents may or may not be working. They're trying to figure out how they're going to pay the bills. What are they going to do with these kids all day? So this can provide some chaos, and children do not respond well to chaos. Poverty, if there's violence in the home or in the community, you know, sometimes in this, I was talking about things being a little different for different people. Some people, myself included, found this break in time to be really beneficial, but that's not the truth for everyone. There's a lot of people that are not handling that very well. And I know as teachers and administrators and social workers and people who care and love for children are worried about some of the children that might be in situations where substance abuse might rise, or and there's very little available to the families to support them. And so they worry about those kids, or those kids with special needs that may be particularly difficult, and the parents may not have the support to be able to manage that. So if we have those parents who have mental illnesses, substance abuse, things like that, could be serious illness, death of a loved one. So we know we're seeing death for many reasons. And one of the things that everybody's talking about is the COVID virus. Lots of things impact children negatively. But we know that the temperament of a child and their experiences will also drive how they respond to stress and trauma, and also the relationships that they have with adults and caregivers. And we know that children who know their caregiver is going to respond to them in a reassuring way and supportive way will have a very different response than children who do not have that security. And so we need to look at ways to support not just the children, but the caregivers as well. Mm-hmm. Let's go on to the next slide. It's a word cloud. And these are stressful times, and I imagine all of you are experiencing some levels of stress as well. And we start thinking about what that might be for children, and they don't really understand what's happening. You know, the media is very hyped up, and we see people responding to that. Children don't really understand what they're seeing or hearing necessarily, but they might be hearing some parents or caregivers talking about the layoffs or isolation, people having to deal with Zoom, unrest, wearing masks. They've just opened up, I'm in Virginia, and they're in phase 2, and I live in an apartment complex, and below me are some dentist office, children's dentist office. And I'm looking, I heard screaming this morning, and looked out the window, and there was a little child. They were trying to get a mask on her to go into the dentist office, and she was having none of it. And then there was somebody there with a thermometer, you know, pointing at her face, and it was just a complete meltdown. And then I see other kids, you know, walk up and they put their masks on and off they go. So, but that's stressful. You don't understand. It was just remarkable, since we were having this conversation earlier. And not all children have been out of care, out of the home. A lot of children have been going to centers this whole time, and that's also stressful, because you can imagine what the caregivers are going through. In Virginia, we had you could have 8 people in the room, including the teachers. So you can imagine how different that would be in terms of routine. In Virginia, we have we don't have very much regulation around group size. So I don't know if it's a silver lining, but we are going to have smaller group sizes in classrooms. So it's just something to think about. Sarah,
Mary
did you
Margaret,
want to add something?
Well,
Go
one
ahead.
of the things when you're talking about the stress on caregivers, it made me think of a conversation I had about a month ago with the executive director of a program that serves kids who have been exposed to toxic stress, and they're affiliated with a hospital, and because of that affiliation, they were keeping their child care open, and he said they had to do as much support to the staff as they did to the children, to help their staff feel comfortable with what was going on. So
I need to unmute. Sorry.
yes, you do.
Can we go to the next slide, please? There we go. So what happens when children are stressed? Well, it causes the stress hormone cortisol to amp up. And there's all kinds of stress. You can't live without stress, right? There's distress and eustress. And stress is what moves us or motivates us to action. But distress with cortisol gives us that fight or flight response. And really early on with children with high levels of stress, especially as they're growing and developing, that can interfere with healthy brain development. Specifically in the hippocampus, in the area of the brain for regulating emotion, but also in the cerebellum, which is that back part of your brain, that reptilian piece of your brain. And when children have high levels of stress with a non-responsive, non-nurturing environment, they go to that fight or flight place, and those neural pathways are stronger than those that go to the hippocampus, which is that reasoning and more the control of emotions. And so it's hyper going to that stress. So when things start to go a little awry, and depending on that child's experience, they may go to that fight or flight response. And just to think about it for a minute, pretend like you were hammering a nail to hang a picture and you hit your thumb, right? And somebody's like, oh, tell me how you feel. Well, you're not going to be able to respond in that moment. You're in pain, you're angry, and you don't want to talk about it. And that is that reptilian brain that is kicking
Right.
in. And there's a lot of kids and teachers, maybe, and parents and caregivers that are in that place because of these prolonged stress that we've seen. And it may not be toxic stress like we might see in a really highly abusive situation, but our worlds have been turned upside down. And so that stress over 3 months is definitely going to be affecting what we see in children's behaviors. And children do communicate their stress through anger, defiance, avoidance, regressive behaviors. They may have new fears that they may never have had. They may feel helpless. They may have separation anxiety. They may have trouble with sleep. Children's depression doesn't always look like you think it would, but there is some sadness, but it manifests itself in a lot of different ways. They may have a hard time focusing, stomach aches, those somatic issues. And this is something I experienced as a special ed teacher at one point, where I had this one little guy that would recreate the trauma of what had happened in his home the night before. And he would literally act out everything that happened, being both his parents and explaining to me in play what had happened in the night before. So we may see that as well. So I'm thinking, as you know, when you go back, that dramatic play area is going to be pretty important as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So again, thinking about that lens of equity. So everybody has a different experience, and some children, especially those that are in poverty, are going to have a higher likelihood of being exposed to environments and experiences that are more stressful or more traumatic. And when, again, children, all children are exposed to trauma, and everybody's trauma is a little bit different. Children of color are more likely to be exposed to adverse experiences because we do see a lot of poverty in these areas. And then we see the American Indian and Alaska Native children more likely than other children to live in poverty, witness violence in their home, live in households where there's substance abuse or mental abuse. I saw something, and Sarah and I were talking about it earlier. I think the Navajo Nation has the most cases of COVID and deaths, like
percentage-wise, yeah,
percentage-wise from all the states. So we've really got some things going on for sure.
Yeah.
Did you want to add anything to that, Sarah?
I don't think so. Thanks.
Okay, let's go ahead and move on. Thank you, Winston. So there's a lot of trauma, and not just in the last 3 months, right? We've been dealing with these traumatized children for years and years. It's just, the community of educators is really focusing on trauma right now, and you'll hear about it kind of all over the place, but it's not something new, but maybe it's something that I'm happy that we're focusing on, because it's a huge, huge need. And nearly 35 million kids in the United States have had one or more types of stress in their life. And half of them have experienced at least one or more types of serious childhood trauma. So this is something that's real, and it's something that we need to adapt to and to provide support to children.
Yeah. Mary Margaret, I would also add in that one of the reasons why we're paying more attention to it than, say, when you and I were starting out in the field is that I believe it was 97, there was the study released on adverse childhood experiences. And in that study, they identified 7 categories of adversity or trauma, and really started to look and see what that did to kids. Because I can remember a time when they said children can't be depressed, children can't have illnesses.
Right. And
Children who are resilient.
I believe there's somebody on this webinar that actually did their doctorate doctorate thesis on trauma and stress. Was that you?
No.
No. What did you tell me it was?
It's policy.
Policy. Ah, thank
Policy.
you. All right. All right. Let's
Closely
move on
related.
then. There we go. So I'm going to let Sarah take the lead from here.
All right, and so we're going to talk, as Mary Margaret had mentioned earlier, about how interactions can help counter the effects of trauma. Next slide, please, Winston. And so the first thing we really want to think about, and for those of you who are familiar with Teachstone and are familiar with class, and somehow I've lost my screen that shows me that slide, which is a little unnerving because everyone who knows me knows that when something goes wrong, I lose it with technology. Regardless.
Those strong relationships and how they matter.
Yeah, those strong relationships and how they matter are really important. And the class is based, so if you know Teachstone, you know that we are the providers of the classroom assessment scoring system. And the classroom assessment scoring system is a way of looking at the effectiveness of teacher-child interactions. The class is based on attachment theory, which basically says that children come into the world biologically predisposed to form emotional attachments with their caregivers. And research studies have shown that children who have strong relationships with caregivers are much more likely to freely explore their environments and take risks, which are key to learning. Mary Margaret, I'm going to ask Winston to go on to the next slide. If you would do it, then I will pull up the PowerPoint on my own computer.
Sure. So how do we help children heal? So when you are feeling trauma or stress, you don't feel safe, right? So one of the things we need to do is help children feel safe, to really encourage them to express how they feel. And they may not be able to do that verbally, so there needs to be options for them through movement, through music, through tactile experiences, through choice in their play, to be able to have some control over what's going on. So we're following their lead and allowing that expression of feelings. I remember one time I was in a classroom doing an observation, and a couple of the kids were in the dramatic play area, and they all had their little pretend cell phones out, and they were calling the police and 911 because somebody had been shot, and the fire department had to come, and they were just acting out this just really traumatic scenario. And the teacher came over and said, you can't talk about that, and sent them on their way and tried to get them to do something else. And that is definitely what children do not need, because being able to recreate that and talk about that is such a teachable moment for us to reassure them that they're safe, repeat what you hear them saying, give them some strategies for what to do in that moment when they're frightened. So following that lead and let them tell their story. Right. Are you ready to go, Sarah? Are you good?
I am, thank you.
Good, awesome, you bet.
Okay, so let's go to the next slide, please. And actually, I can't see it, so I'm just that you've done that.
So it's on the resiliency slide.
Yep. Yeah. No, I've got the slides up on my PowerPoint on my computer. I just can't see them. So we're really talking about how effective interactions can promote resiliency. And if resiliency isn't a term you're familiar with, it's really the ability that kids have to overcome adversity. And we know that some kids who experience a lot of adversities move beyond that, and then there are some kids who are really stuck, and it's really hard for them to do that. So the definition we've got here is that it is a dynamic process that lies within relationships. And what we know from multiple studies is that a close bond between caring, emotionally stable adults who are sensitive to the needs of kids help protect children from adversity. And the first study that really looked at this is called the Kauai Longitudinal Study. And in this study, researchers followed almost 700 children from the island of Kauai in Hawaii into adulthood. And there were kids who truly experienced a lot of the kinds of stressful factors that Mary Margaret talked about before. But what was interesting was that some of the children who experienced this adversity developed really serious problems. They were more likely not to have graduated from high school. They were more likely to be substance abusers. They were more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system, more likely to become teen parents. So some of the things we think, correlate with poverty. And a lack of stability, or actually let's say a lack of stability in the home is probably a better way to say it, because there are some kids who grow up in poverty and have a great advocate and they do beautifully. But the long and short of it is that about a third of the children did really well. They graduated from high school. Some of them went on to college. Some of them went on to trade schools. They bought homes. They married. They had families. And when the research team looked back longitudinally to figure out what was going on, they said, essentially it was a protective factor. And for these individuals, the protective factor was this close bond with that caring, emotionally stable adult. And it didn't have to be a parent. Sometimes parents have so many problems themselves that they may not be that person, but it can be another family member, it can be a neighbor, and most importantly, to all of you who are teachers, it could be a teacher, and often it was a teacher who really believed in that child. And Mary Margaret, will you tell the story you heard about the talk the guy gave at Stanford?
It was the Stand for Children, and it was
I'm sorry, Stand for Children.
The Stand for Children in 1996, and it was a march on Washington, and it was amazing.
Got it.
Yeah, still remember that. And we had lots and lots of speakers that came. It was put on by the Children's Defense Fund, and I think there was over 100,000 people in the mall in DC. And this one gentleman came up, and he was one of the speakers, and he was the editor of the Washington Post magazine, which is the insert in the newspaper that has it's like a slick magazine, and it has the crossword puzzle in it, because we used to do that every Sunday. And but anyway, it's really a nice little, I guess I haven't looked at a regular newspaper in a long time, but I imagine it's still there. But anyway, he talked about his adverse experiences, and he'd come through just the worst upbringing. But he was the editor of this magazine, and he thought about his neighbors and friends as he was growing up, and some of them became quite successful, and some of them stayed mired in poverty, and just not really had substance abuse and all these problems. And he really wanted to know why. And so he talked to people, not just his friends, but he did sort of a informal study, and 100% of the people that got out said the same thing. There was one person that made them feel like they were important and special. And it could have been a teacher, it could have been the minister, it could have been the postman. But the point is that there's one person that makes a child feel like they are the most important child on the planet. And that is
believe in them.
Yeah, they believe in you, and they will do what they can to support you. And that I know that you may not even know that you're that one person, but you have that opportunity to be a life-changing teacher.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you, Mary Margaret. Winston, would you go to the next slide? So the next slide is, it's just another way of framing this, but there's Bob Pianta, who's the lead author on the class. He and Daniel Walsh put out a book in 1998 that was called Enhancing Relationships Between Teachers and Students. And one of the things that they found through their background research is that supportive relationship with at least one teacher is a very important protective factor that influence the later success of children who we might ordinarily consider to be at high risk for school failure. So really, teachers, these supportive relationships can really serve as a buffer for children. And you know, and my takeaway from that is never give up on a child. Be there for them. All right, next slide, Winston.
Sarah, I'm just monitoring the questions, and if you are having
Yes.
any kind of technical issues, please type into the chat box and not the question box so that we can monitor that. Just off the side, there's an awful lot coming in on that panel. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mary Margaret. So since we're talking about interactions, I wanted to give you some real clear information about how interactions can help. So Mary Margaret earlier mentioned cortisol levels, that stress hormone, and I suspect most, if not all of you, are already familiar with what cortisol is. We have a colleague, her name is Bridget Hatfield, who used to be at the University of Virginia, and she did a study which we call the SPIT study. So yes, saliva, the saliva study. And she looked at kids in publicly funded child care programs and measured their cortisol levels. Typically, cortisol is high when we wake up in the morning, but it typically decreases across the course of the day. But there was research that showed that some children in full-time child care actually, their cortisol levels increased at the end of the day, so that instead of just seeing this nice steady decline of cortisol, they had a V shape. So it was high, it went down, and then again by the end of the day, the kids were just as stressed as they were at the beginning of the morning. And what Bridget Hatfield and her colleagues did is that they collected class data and looked at the emotional support that was going on in that classroom. And what they found was that children who were in emotionally responsive classrooms where teachers were sensitive to their needs, helped them feel safe and secure, that there was an overall decrease of stress hormones across the day, to the point that for some of the kids, it was very close to the levels of stress hormones in children who were staying at home. So that's a really important thing for us to think about. Again, going back to what teachers can do to help kids who are very stressed. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to move into those strategies, and we'll talk about social emotional learning. We're also going to talk about some dealing with kids who are having some problematic behaviors. And while I know that most of you aren't concerned about that, for those of you who are, we're going to delve into that as well. Next slide again, please. Okay, our first slide, our first advice or suggestions for you about strategies to support children is to take care of yourself. You know, regardless of whether or not we have been with kids all along because we're in child care centers or considered to be essential workers, whatever it is, this has been a real change for a lot of people. And as we all know, there are many people who don't have jobs. There are people who've lost their homes, and while it may not have impacted you specifically, I'll go back to Mary Margaret's earlier comment about, you know, being worried and caring about your children. And there is such a thing as secondary PTSD, where you take in what's happening to other people and you feel very stressed. So we want you to take care of yourselves, pay attention to your feelings. You need to recognize what's within and without of your realm of control. There are things you can control. You can control how you process information. You can control how you act. You can control what you do to be safe. We can't control the whole world, so recognizing that is really important. This sounds just like your doctor, the third bullet, but eat and exercise and maintain those contacts with your friends and your colleagues, especially once you get back to school. Those connections with your colleagues are going to be critically important, so you can support each other, and whether it's through a Slack group or a Facebook channel or you know, a brisk walk 6 feet away around the parking lot after work just to check in to see how people are doing. It's going to be really important. Don't try to be that super teacher. Do your best. And I suspect that there's a lot in the news about the COVID lag and the things that kids will have missed out on not being in school. And then, of course, so many places, summer programs aren't running either. And so there's going to be, for some kids, a really long time without that structure. And you're going to be really worried about your kids, and you're going to want to do everything you can, but trying to do everything is a great recipe for burnout. So do your best, but try not to solve the world. And know when to take a break. I one year coached a teacher who taught in an inner city school, and she was really good with kids who had challenging behaviors. And as a result, she had more than her fair share of kids with challenging behaviors in her classroom. And she and her assistant, she was fortunate enough that they had both worked together for years, and they had this quiet signal that they would send to the other that said, I need a break. And they had a plan of exactly what they would have children do when the other one needed to just step outside the building and walk around the parking lot. So yeah, you have to understand your feelings. You have to take care of yourself before you can help the children. Next slide, please.
Let me jump in real quickly, if you don't mind, Sarah. Apparently we can't use the chat box, my bad. So go ahead and keep going into the question box, and we'll be taking a look at that. Have you ever, well, gosh, haven't been on an airplane in a really long time, and I'm okay with that because I was on them all the time. You know, when you're on there and they say, put the air mask on before you help somebody else, we got to wear our air masks for sure.
Yeah, we've got to put our masks on first.
Yeah, somebody mentioned, I had a question, I'm trying to find it here. Basically, classrooms change every year, right? And so you're probably not going to be having the same kids that you had on March 19th or whatever it was when the whole world shut down. But you can do the same things to provide an emotionally supportive classroom. And it may even be something that you have to be even more intentional about setting that stage. I think we're going to talk about that earlier, but the pay attention to your feelings, recognizing all those things, pause. If a child is presenting a behavior that you're not sure what to do about, it's okay to take a breath and have a moment. I know when I'm training sometimes and I can't think of how I want to handle a question, I do the famous Mary Margaret water trick, and I just have a little sip. Sometimes I need two, but you might not have a can of sparkling water in your hand, but you might have a moment where you can just take a breath. Or you might say, I'm really thinking about how to handle this, just so that and that's also a nice model for children on what to do, but take a pause. You do not have to rush in with the fire hose immediately. You can stay there and try to see what it is do I need to do in this situation, because every child's going to be asking for your attention in a different way. And I'm going to let you. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you, Mary Margaret. All right, I presume we're on the slide that says keep in mind. And so I hope so. But the first one is that we do have children who've been out for a long time. And as we mentioned earlier, children have had really different experiences. And so we need to learn about these experiences because, we've got a colleague here, and she's got a toddler, and her mother lives down the street. And so her mother just comes over and takes care of her toddler. So everything is just absolutely fine. But if we compare that to a family where there isn't really anybody, where both parents are working from home, or actually maybe both parents are essential workers and they're parsing out care among neighbors, and the child is going from neighbor to neighbor, or different family members are coming in every day, and then maybe somebody in the family gets sick, or one of the parents loses their job, that's a really very different experience. And so what we can learn about their experiences is going to be really important, and asking parents just to say, so tell me what it was like for you, for your kids during the COVID-19 pandemic, I think is a really good way to get some basic information. It doesn't have to be in depth, everything you need to know, but yeah. And Mary Margaret talked about establishing these new routines. There are some cases where kids might be looping, or you might be a small program and the 3s and the 4s are together. And so you may have those same kids. We can't expect them to come back and just do everything just the way they used to do it. So you may have to really work on, they may need some time to adjust to that. And gosh, you know, that emotional support, making children feel safe and secure, and that classroom organization where we are proactively managing children's behavior, where having clear behavioral expectations, kids know what to do, they have something to do. It's going to be really important. But yeah, that would be important. And then teacher sensitivity, again, being very, very responsive, it will be important. Having regard for student perspectives, which is a big piece of following kids' leads, is going to be super important. And then behavior management, all could be critical,
And we've
depending
got,
on. Go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, we just have the best question that relates exactly to what you were saying. It was like Suzanne actually knew what we were going to be talking about, so I'm going to read it. What do you suggest if masks and physical distancing are required? And having children play parallel rather than together? It's like teaching children to wash their hands, or teaching children to put their coats up. You know, physical distancing is going to be something that you're going to have to scaffold for them. But a lot of kids are already wearing masks. I can't imagine what it'd be like with a toddler, but okay. I saw what happened in the parking lot this morning. But make it a part of your curriculum, is how do you deal with physical distancing? And they will adapt to that, but you have to have those clear expectations. You have to be sensitive to the child that is fidgeting with a mask, or is really uncomfortable, and scaffold ways for them to get that. So it may not be your first week of school, month of school activities that you typically might have planned. This might just be about social distancing and physical distancing, and wearing and washing your hands, and how to play with your friends, and how to do, you know, fist bumps and all of that. That could be your curriculum as you come into this new normal.
Yeah. That makes me think, I used to teach preschoolers with autism, and I knew that the first 2 to 3 weeks of every school year was not necessarily going to be very curriculum based. It was going to be based on just getting kids used to being there, learning routines, things like that. All right, so next slide, please, Winston. So here we have some ways we can build relationships with children, and these are things that you probably already do anyway, but greet them when they arrive. Try to understand how they're feeling. You may not be able to ask them, how are you feeling today? But try to understand through their actions, facial expressions, etc. Talk to them about what's going on outside of school. Just, if they're new kids, get to know what they're interested in, what they like to do, follow their leads. Listen to what they say, respond to them, let them know that what they have to say is important to you. Sit with them at lunch, talk with them, learn about them, and then you know, when they're excited, have that matched affect and be excited with them. A little
Build
piece
that
of
sense
positive
of
climate there.
build that sense of safety and community, and this is your opportunity to bond with them, and to get to know them, because that's where you become that life-changing teacher, is when you connect with them and you know something about them. And sometimes that includes that pause and taking a breath. And how can I build a community? How, especially with preschoolers, they really want to build friendships, and so this is a beautiful opportunity to do that. There is something that happens in your brain when you hear your name. It causes you to pay attention, and it also raises your serotonin level. And not using your name like in a yell, but actually in a respectful way. But you know, remember why you came to teaching, and remember what it is that you can do for children, and build those relationships. Relationships so built on interactions, on what you do or say, and how that child is responded to, and their message, what they take away from that. My teacher cares about me, or my teacher's too busy.
Right.
This is a chaotic place, or this is a place where I know what to do when I walk in the door. And these are the things that are foundational for children's outcomes.
Absolutely. Okay, next slide, Winston. Okay, and so this goes part and parcel with what we were talking about before, but to promote social emotional learning, we really need to help children understand and manage their feelings. And again, that's a huge piece of teacher sensitivity in the class. Kids lack that vocabulary initially, so we need to help them understand it. Little kids are still learning to self-regulate, so helping them learn to manage their emotions is a really important thing. Helping them be able to take other people's perspective, so recognizing their peers' perspective. Like, if I take that toy from that other little boy, he's not going to be happy with me, and to understand that and understand why, and teaching them to cooperate and problem solve. So they're all just a big piece of social emotional learning, which again are things that you all are doing in your classrooms all the time. We just need to make sure we remember about it. Next
And
slide, please.
Margaret says, how can social distancing be appropriate for preschool? I don't think it can, but it might be what we have to deal with. Fortunately, we know that the younger ones have a much smaller percentage of contracting the virus, but we still need to help them understand this new way of being.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things we have at the end of this PowerPoint is some resources that might be from 0 to 3, children's, the CDC, other places that might be helpful. Okay, next. Oh, I said next slide, but I'm still expecting it to go on my slide. So we'll talk briefly about strategies that support behavior. I'll do it pretty quickly because we want to make sure we have a few minutes for questions at the end. Next slide, please, Winston. Okay, and so one of our strategies for supporting behavior is also to help us reframe the child's behavior, to think about it from the child's perspective. So the child is always thinking about, what do I need and how can I get it? And what children need to feel is that they're a valued member of the community. They need to feel that they're important. If a child feels that they're invisible or that their child doesn't like them, it's really much harder for them to manage and self-regulate their behavior. When teachers are inconsistent with their expectations, for example, sometimes you say that I have to raise my hand to talk at circles, and other times it's okay to call out. Those are inconsistencies, and children don't know what's expected and may think, no matter what I do, the teacher gets mad at me. And then being confused they'll think, well, I'm confused, I don't know what to do, and then all of a sudden my teacher doesn't like me anymore. And so those safe, consistent, predictable environments are really helpful for children. Okay, next slide, Winston. Okay. And again, here we're going to talk about reframing. So young children can't easily understand or describe their feelings, and they often get frustrated and end up expressing their what we call their big feelings physically. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're misbehaving. It means that they really are just having a hard time letting us know what's going on with them. And children will engage in behaviors that work for them, meaning that that if I cry because I'm frustrated and someone comes over, then that worked for me. If I cry because I don't want to do something and the teacher says, okay, we'll wait a few minutes, you don't have to do that right now, it worked for them, so they'll do it again. And there's a lot of research that shows that these behaviors that we find challenging are telling us something. And you can see some of the things on that slide. And remember that children, particularly children who are experiencing adversity, they may not be able to really clearly articulate their feelings and tell us what's going on through their behavior. And I can think of a little girl who was in a preschool where I was working 30 years ago, and unfortunately she watched her father kill her mother, and she quit talking. She withdrew and she quit talking. She couldn't tell us what was going on, but because obviously the school found out what had happened, but her lack of speech and her extreme withdrawal and her clinginess to her teacher's leg were all communicating something to us. And so that's one of the things we really need to keep in mind. We might ask a child how they are, and they'll go, I'm okay. And when really, let's look at their behavior and figure out what they're trying to tell us. Okay, next slide, please. And so one of the things to think about in terms of your classroom is, reframing behaviors or helping with problem behaviors is, are your expectations clear? Are you consistent in how you respond to children's behaviors? Are you proactive? Are you responding in a reactive way to misbehavior, or are you gently redirecting misbehavior? And then finally, are you making sure the kids have something interesting to do? We know that there are classrooms that are well managed experience fewer behavior problems. Okay, next slide. And going back to framing the information, thinking about the children, the first thing you're going to want to look for is patterns in the children's behavior. Look at, it's called antecedent behavior consequence, or an ABC chart. You look at what happens before a behavior, you look at what happens during the behavior, you look at what happens afterwards. And that's going to tell us what's triggering the behavior. The behavior may be that it's a time of day and they're hungry. The behavior may be, I taught a little guy who had a lot of auditory issues, and he went berserk when the fire alarm went off. And yeah, that's all I can say about that. But we figured out what was going on when he lost it, and were able to, for example, have the office let us know in advance when there's going to be a planned fire drill and things like that. And then, so figure out what the behavior is telling you, and try to think of an appropriate way to deal with that. Or, for example, I'll go back to this little guy. He also didn't like it when just the school bell went off. And so, and in our elementary school, we were supposed to walk down one side of the hall, but we allowed him to walk down the side of the hall that didn't have the school bell on it if we were in the hall at a time when the bell was going to go off, and it really helped him a lot. And so you'll also want to think about how to reduce problem behaviors, reinforce those behaviors that are good, and then, as we've been saying all along, take the time to get to know your kids. Mary Margaret, would you like to do this next slide on?
Sure. I was looking at some of these really great questions that are coming up too, and I know we're running out of time. And so spending time one-on-one with children, that this is something that really builds relationships. And it's like, how can I do one-on-one with every child? You don't have to do it all day long, but find a moment where you can spend a little time with them. It might be during greeting time, it might be walking down the hall, it might be helping them put on their mask. But we want to give them some control over what is going on in that classroom, and let them lead the relationship or what the interactions, except where they am. And so where they are, we're giving them some sense of autonomy that makes them feel powerful. Hope you're okay, Sarah. Building on positive relationships with them rather than teaching, and you'll learn a lot about those children. So that through interactions, one-on-one, let the child lead, be generally interested in what they're saying and telling you instead of coming up with what you think should come next. I want to just throw in this question from Melanie. It says, are you concerned that wearing a mask, this is so funny because we just had this conversation, mask may inhibit children's social emotional development, not seeing the emotions in the face. Similarly, are you concerned that a teacher wearing a mask will inhibit language development by not seeing the form sound in their mouth? Yes.
Yes.
But there are other things that you can do to connect with children.
Right. And something else I would say that that harks back to Suzanne's question, I believe her name was, is that we are actually working on looking at different ways that these effective interactions as measured by class can look in a time when there's social distance and people are wearing masks.
Right. And I think that'll be a part of what Stephanie was talking about as well. And I just, unfortunately, we're running out of time, but those are super great questions.
Yeah.
But if you can take that time, if you can give one child 2 minutes or 5 minutes out of your day, one time a week even, that's going to build those interactions. And if you can let the children feel like they have some control, that is going to build a lot of sense of safety and connection.
Yeah.
You want to go on the next slide?
So these are the resources that we talked about. We are recording this, and the recording will be made available to you, so you can come back and look at these. Also, I believe that we'll get a copy of all of your questions, and we will work to answer them over time and get them back to you all. And then
These
Winston,
resources are fabulous. I just want to give Sarah a moment to get her, she needs her water. I looked at all these resources again this morning, and they are really great. Some of them are video, really simple to read, don't take a ton of time. So they're super wonderful resources. We also have something that Teachstone is rolling out in August. That is going to be a kit that supports social emotional development and learning. So we'll go ahead and let Winston talk about this.
Yep.
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Sarah and Mary Margaret, and thank you all for attending. And we're coming right up to the end of our time here. Actually, we're a minute over, but I did want to mention we have a new trauma-informed care course that's coming out in August. This is a really exciting series of online courses, and we have transfer to practice webinars that we can work with you on too. But there's information on our website. If you just go to teachstone.com, you'll see this logo on the homepage, and you can learn more about this series. But we've enlisted the help of subject matter experts from across the field with expertise in different areas of trauma-informed care. Sarah Haddon being one of those experts, and so we're really excited about this course and hope that you will check it out.
And Winston, we have that teacher summit coming up in August as well.
Yep,
Yes.
that's another exciting thing is we'll be emailing out actually information in the follow-up email. But we have Interact. We ran our Interact summit virtually this past spring and had tons of attendance and huge success. People were really excited about the experience, and so we decided to run another virtual conference specifically for teachers in early August. And so plans for that are just shaping up. We just opened up registration this week, and we'll send out a link to that page as well. Really excited for that.
And Winston, will they be getting a certificate automatically because they were on GoToWebinar?
Yes. So there are a few questions about that. Thanks, Mary Margaret. So there are in 24 hours, GoToWebinar will automatically send out the certificate of attendance for anybody that attended today's session. And we captured your email address when you registered, and GoToWebinar tells us who attended, so you will receive that automatically in a day. And one last update here. And Michael, I don't know if you wanted to mention this, but there is the next webinar for Texas AUIC, so let's just speak to that a bit.
Thank you, Winston, and thank you, Sarah, Mary Margaret, again. Thank you for all the wonderful information you shared about trauma and especially answering the chat questions. That's always one of the biggest things people want to see, is that you're seeing the chats and answering them. So I do thank you for taking time for reading those. Please excuse the slide, as when we had this set up yesterday, it's actually changed. This will be to be announced for a different time frame, because those of you that attended our conference last year, our face-to-face conference that we had, Teachstone sponsored a No Small Matter viewing at one of our keynote presentations that we did. And No Small Matters is actually going to take the spot of this area from 7 to 8. No Small Matters on June 25th is going to be airing on Facebook Live, the documentary about how powerful early childhood education is. So again, look at Facebook Live, look at No Small Matters, and take a look to see and sign up for their Facebook Live event. So Anna will be with us again at a different time frame. We'll schedule that later. But we definitely want people the opportunity to watch No Small Matter. Thank you guys again.
Yeah,
Thank you. And it's a wonderful
put
movie.
in a quick plug.
Yeah.
If you haven't seen, I've seen it 3 times, and I cry every time. It's wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for being here and hanging on, even though we've gone over a little bit.
Appreciate your time, and good luck to all of you.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Okay. Bye.